So before I start, I just want to say that thank the National Science Foundation, whose grant made this study possible. And also I want to note that in the interest of time, I'm not presenting all the findings from the paper in this presentation. So if you're at all interested in this topic, please read the paper. It's really, there's a lot more in there. So, all right. So I'm going to start by talking about the challenge of therapeutic games. And when I say therapeutic games, I'm referring to really any type of game, whether adapted from an existing game or created specifically for the purpose, that is used to address health. So whether that's cognitive health or physical health or even mental health, that would all fall under the domain of therapeutic games in the way that I'm talking about them. So I'm going to show you some examples, and then we're going to go on to the challenges. Okay? So these games are used for things like cognitive training. So on the right here, you see a screenshot from a game, Medal of Honor, Pacific Assault, which is a first-person shooter game that's been used to improve, successfully used actually, to improve spatial ability in younger adults. We also have games that are used to improve cognitive abilities in older adults. And here you see one that's been used successfully called Rise of Nations. It's a real-time strategy game where you control, entire armies and cities and try and beat your opponents. These games are also used for things like stroke rehabilitation. And so on the right here, you see a prototype of, it's an ARM-based controller that has been adapted for the game Peggle. It's like a puzzle game, kind of a puzzle action arcade game. And the idea here is that you have to move your arm in a way that is similar to physical rehabilitation that people might go through after a stroke, but you're doing it to play the game. You're not just doing these motions on your own without any kind of feedback or context or fun. So some of the challenges here, in terms of some of these games, there is a level of requisite difficulty. So particularly when I'm talking about cognitive training games, we know that they need to be very challenging. And that they can be challenging to the point that they're really overwhelming. And so that's going to be a big issue where you know that you're really pushing people, and you might be pushing people past what they're really comfortable with. You also need to be really concerned about issues of intrinsic motivation, because the idea with these games is that you're not going to just do it for a couple sessions and then never pick it up again. We want people to actually engage in these games, similar to like exercise. You don't want people to just use the treadmill twice and then like stick it in the corner and never use it again. You want people to actually choose to engage in this activity and do it for enough time and do it periodically. And I probably don't need to convince this audience that games are a good way of fostering that. Although there are some people we really do have to convince. So we're going to actually be looking at the concept of flow. And so for anyone who's not familiar with it, flow is a state in which a person experiences enjoyment through meeting a challenge that matches his or her skill. And then during the process, they become absorbed in the experience to the point of total focus. And flow is applied a lot to, it was originally developed for sports, but it's used in context games a lot, and then things like work, and it's actually a really good concept. So we're looking at 9 subscales of flow experience. And in this particular research that I'm communicating to you all, we are focusing on 2 of those subscales, clear goals and unambiguous feedback. And so clear goals is basically how easily the player feels that they can understand the goals they have during the game. And the feedback is how well they feel that they can understand the feedback that the game is giving them. And so one of the reasons we're particularly looking at these 2 is that some prior research has suggested that a sense of mastery, as fostered through clear goals and feedback, may be especially important in a video game training program for older adults. And since we're talking about video game training programs for older adults, that's our area, we're particularly interested in these 2 here. So The results presented here are from a larger study of a video game-based cognitive intervention for older adults. We are trying to improve various cognitive abilities, and one thing that's we had 103 participants, and these are the ones who actually played the game. We also had a no-contact control group, but 103 who played the game. And a couple unusual things here, too, is our mean age was 78, which is actually really high for studies of this type. I think our range was from 65, which is the lowest you can go and be considered an older adult, at least for us, up to 96. So it was a pretty big range there. And we classified about a third of them as non-gamers, a third as occasional gamers, and a third as regular gamers. But I just want to note that our classification for regular gamers was pretty loose. So if you played, solitaire on your computer a couple times a week, we would call you a regular gamer. So we recruited the participants from independent and assisted living communities around Raleigh, North Carolina, religious centers, low-income senior housing, and also from the community. So one thing this actually lets us do is see a larger spectrum of demographic characteristics, physical health, and cognitive abilities within our study because we had a range of participant types. So one thing that having 103 participants allows us to do is actually look at individual differences. So how individual differences between the participants affected how they experienced the game. And one of the things that we were looking at is positive affect. And it's basically a person's tendency to experience positive emotions in daily life. And I just want to clarify that we were actually measuring this as a trait, so as a personality characteristic prior to any experience with the intervention game. So some other work has looked at positive affect as mood states in response to games, but we were measuring this as a personality characteristic. And one of the reasons we looked at it was because positive affect is associated with engagement in social activity, and social play is one of the things that we were looking at in this study. All right, and the game we used for this study, we selected it in part on the basis of results from some focus groups we conducted with older adults. It's called Boom Blocks. It's from EA Games, and it's a 3D puzzle game for the Nintendo Wii. And so you interact with it using the Wiimote, mostly naturalistic movements. So if you're throwing a ball in the game, which is one of the most common interaction types, you actually make a throwing motion. And there are only 2 buttons you have to use during the game. Okay, and it's a series of puzzles. So one of the most common things is you have these structures of blocks, and here you see the blue blocks. You have to knock those to the ground with as few throws as possible. So the fewer throws, the higher your score, and you need a certain minimum score to move on. Okay. Here's an example quickly. This is actually at the last stage. There's only one step left in the puzzle. Here the player is targeting the weak point of the structure on the left. And so they're trying to get this structure to topple over because when the green blocks contact each other, they'll actually explode. And so it's a more efficient way of getting those blue blocks to the ground. Yeah, lovely explosion there for you. All right, so the design of our study, participants were randomized to both a difficulty condition and a social condition. So our difficulty conditions, the high difficulty, was basically unaltered Boom Blocks levels. These are the levels that come with the game. In the low difficulty condition, they played lab-created Boom Blocks levels only. So these are levels that we specifically made to be low in cognitive requirements. And frankly, after having played a bunch of them, they're really boring. But both groups also did some training extra levels that we made. And I just want to also mention that both the interface was the same for both the levels, the on-screen interface and everything. So it's similar. It's just different in cognitive requirements. There's also a social condition. So the people who were randomized into the social condition played with a partner, another older adult in the study, and they took turns playing. And then in the individual condition, they played alone. The design of the study, we started with a pretest, and that's where all of our personality measures were, followed by 15 hours of gameplay spread over a 3-week period. And we assessed flow on the last day of gameplay, and then we had a post-test. So just to reiterate here, we are looking at both game and person characteristics. So difficulty, social condition, positive affect as a person characteristic, and then flow as our outcome variable. So our results. First of all, higher positive affect was associated with more total flow, which is perhaps not a very surprising result. We also found better, well actually I'll skip this part because I already cut it out to save time. But basically, if you just look, basically you can take someone's positive affect combined with their physical health, which I'll go into more if I have time, and together these two variables alone can predict almost 20% of the variability between participants in how they experience the game, which to me is a really big percent for just two variables that we're talking about. So game difficulty and flow just starts to get a little bit more interesting here. Greater total flow in the low difficulty condition. And this was actually a surprise to me because we were afraid after playing 15 hours of our low difficulty levels, which actually in some cases repeated if a participant got through all of them, we were afraid people would drop out. But it's actually the flow was greater in this condition. And that was true for all the subscales except one of flow. So again, this was contrary to our expectations. We also found in terms of social condition and flow that the clear goals subscale was higher in the social condition than in the individual condition. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. All right. So we also found some interactions, which if you are into psychology research or any kind of research, interactions are the really exciting part for you. So we found an interaction between difficulty condition and social condition for two subscales, so that clear goals subscale and the unambiguous feedback subscale. And to show you what that looked like, you have here on the x-axis the difficulty conditions, so low difficulty and then high difficulty. And then you have the flow on the y-axis. And you see that in the low difficulty condition, the level of how clearly they understood the goals that they had in the game was the same whether they were in the social condition or the individual condition. However, in the high difficulty condition, although the people in the social condition maintained that level of flow, people who played by themselves experienced significantly less flow in terms of clear goals. And we see the same pattern is repeated here for unambiguous feedback. So we actually have here this significant interaction between social condition and difficulty condition. So we wanted to look more at this social effect, and so one of the things we wanted to look at was positive affect, because of we know it has this influence on social experience. And so you see here, on the x-axis, you have their positive affect scores. So higher scores mean they have a greater tendency to experience positive emotions in daily life. And then on the y-axis, you have their flow in terms of clear goals. And you see that it's actually the same pattern here for the low difficulty, whether you played by yourself or you played with a partner. However, when we look at the high difficulty condition, just look at the black dotted line first. People who played by themselves, if they were low in positive affect, they basically took a big hit from game difficulty, and they experienced a lot less flow than people who were high in positive affect. So if you played in the hard condition and you were high in positive affect, it was fine. You still experienced the same level of the clear goals, but it wasn't the same story if you were low in positive affect. Whereas if you played in a social condition, you basically preserved that feeling of clear goals by playing with a partner, especially, right, for those people who are low in positive affect, the ones who took the big hit from the difficulty condition. So, to summarize and talk a little bit more about these findings, the main thing is that difficulty in a game reduced flow for older adults. And this is actually a really big problem because the studies, especially the studies coming out now, these types of games need to be so challenging that it can be hard to get people to even complete the study. It's a big problem, and honestly, our game that we used for this, it wasn't hard enough. And so the game we're making now is actually harder, and so we're especially concerned about this impact of difficulty on flow. But we also found that the negative impact of difficulty on two aspects of flow, so how clearly you perceived your in-game goals and how well you understood the feedback that the game gave you, can actually be moderated by social interaction. And so we found that cooperative social play can help maintain flow for older adults, even during challenging conditions of gameplay. We also found that personality matters in how older adults experience therapeutic games. And specifically, we found that playing with a partner actually protected the low positive affect older adults from the negative effect of difficulty on flow, and specifically as it related to understanding the goals in the game levels. And so for future directions, we want to go beyond flow, and we want to examine the impact of individual differences and game characteristics on measurable in-game behaviors. So one of the great things about this study is we actually recorded gameplay. So we have front-facing view of the participant, side-facing view, and then a feed from the game itself, and we have that recorded for the participants who played the game. And so we can go, we have a coding scheme, we can actually go and look at any kind of the behaviors that they exhibited during the game, whether it was in-game or social interaction or emotional expression. And we want to be able to address the question of how social play protects flow. Like, what mechanism? Is it, are they collaboratively problem solving? Is it protecting their emotional experience? We want to know that. And we also want to examine the matches between players in this social condition, because in this study, assignment to a partner was random. And so we want to know if some of the matches were more protective of flow than others, and if so, why were they more protective? What characteristics about the matches made them help more than maybe other matches that didn't help as much? And I just want to say we have a lot of data in this study. We also have daily measures of mood, stress. We have accelerometer data from the Wiimote. We have GSR, the skin response data for arousal. So I'm open to suggestions, so see me after the talk if you have any great ideas. Thank you.